Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. And thank you for joining us, and welcome to our next session here at IoT World's Industrial Metaverse Day. Include industrial metaverse features in your existing IoT platform, which is brought to you by IoT World and sponsored by UrsaLeo. Now, I want to point out that a large part of the value of these sessions is the opportunity to engage with us and the speakers that are here. So please engage in the three ways that we have to do this. We've got a QA window here in the Zoom platform. There's also a chat window, and I'm going to differentiate those two for a moment. And then if you want to engage with us, you can also use social media. So only post your questions in the Q&A window if you can. That'll help us to track them and keep them organized for when we're answering them now or post-event. You can also post them on the social channels using hashtag Metaverse Day. That's hashtag Metaverse Day. And someone on our team will relay those to us, and we'll get them out there for conversation. Now, for general comments, please use the chat window. So in fact, why don't you drop us a note right now and let us know where you're logging in from and what brought you to our session today. So before we get into the topic of the hour, if you just humor me and give me a couple minutes to give you a little bit of an overview of our organization. IoT World is the leading authority on industrial IoT. We're the digital media outlet bringing the latest industrial Internet of Things and ICS cybersecurity virtual conferences and content to a global community of over 284,000 decision makers and influencers. IoT World focuses on delivering daily insights on the industrial Internet of Things across multiple verticals online. We curate a series of virtual events that punctuate the calendar, drawing thousands of delegates from around the world. And in this session, we're going to discuss the benefits of adding metaverse features to an IoT platform. So joining us today for this interactive dialogue are two bleeding edge experts in this emerging area of technology. We have Mr. John Burton, who's the co-founder and CEO of UrsaLeo, a technology company that's centered on leveraging their 3D immersive platform to transform the way organizations collect, visualize, and utilize IoT data. We also have Mr. J.B. Farge, who's XR Solutions Manager at Subsea 7, a global juggernaut in the delivery of offshore projects and services for the energy industry. So gentlemen, welcome, and thank you for your willingness to share today.
Well, thanks for having us, Greg.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you for having us.
Our pleasure. Now, you both have an extensive amount of experience from a technical standpoint on all the germane topics of this, from augmented reality to virtual reality to XR, 3D scanning, as well as some finely honed skills in entrepreneurial leadership. So why don't we just jump into the discussion? I know there was a session earlier on today that was completely focused on defining the industrial metaverse. So why don't we do the same thing just to kick things off? So maybe John, if you want to grab the con for a second, what the heck is the industrial metaverse?
Yeah, so obviously metaverse was a term that I think came from Facebook originally when they decided to rebrand themselves as Meta. And then the industrial metaverse from our point of view is really the point where a whole bunch of different technologies collide and are then available to be used in industrial context. And we've already talked about AR, VR, so the XR world. You've also got things like very powerful gaming engines that can be used now to render 3D objects very, very quickly with minimal compute resources. And then as we're in the context of IoT, you've got the whole world of Industry 4.0, big data. And I think it's when you put all those things together and there's something that uses those technologies, that's what we call the industrial metaverse.
Got it. So JB, you want to add anything to that from your perspective?
Yeah, it's funny what John said resonates with me, and also the fact that we have to differentiate, we have to make that education process within the peers and our coworker as well, because I had people coming up to me using virtuality or seeing something in virtuality in an immersive, like multi-user room, and ask me, is this the metaverse? So like there's an education portion to be done. And ultimately what I think describe it is like we in industry usually are familiar with the digital twin terminology, even though I've seen a definition that could include more than 380 definition of that. But the idea about connected things, that layer of collaboration and basically overlayer accessible from anywhere, and that collaboration aspect in a visual way, this is what the idea of the metaverse is, and an industrial metaverse to be specific.
Yeah, so JB, I know I alluded to what you folks do, but maybe just take a couple seconds so we can set the stage. I know John's been with us before, and I want John to elaborate a little bit on UrsaLeo's ventures too, but if you could just tell us what you guys are doing. How are you leveraging the metaverse with Subsea 7?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd like to introduce the company in layman terms as the plumbers of the sea. What we do, we engineer, procure, transport, and install pipeline and subsea structure from the seabed to the surface. And within that company, what I do, I basically introduce and scale immersive solution for operational processes and also engineering processes. The way we've been using basically metaverse technology, if I can put it this way, in a first step was to basically connect our design systems in order to be collaborative in a 3D one-to-one scale immersive space across different regions. So we've done this with specific software, proprietary software at the time, that was basically allowing us to have a single instance that was still requiring a lot of graphic power on single computers. And then having that collaboration layer across multiple disciplines and regions to do these design reviews to basically check if there was some clashes. That was our first array into what we could consider the metaverse. Now, what we definitely want to see in the future is how do we empower our basically employees to enter this metaverse, or how do we leverage that to basically allow them to be a participant within that ecosystem?
Wow. That's an interesting perspective on it. And there have to be some unique challenges to that type of an operational environment that you're not going to see in a terrestrial space. So talk to us a little bit about that. What are the challenges? I mean, you're at sea, right? You're under the sea.
So connectivity is number one. Because connectivity so long story short, we have big metal boxes that floats on the sea in remote areas. So even if you have connectivity within your vessels, that connectivity is limited to a specific area on that vessel. It's usually provided by satellite. But ultimately, like for instance, I'll take a very good example, which is offshore remote assistance. For those who are not familiar with, we basically have a device, a headset, such as the HoloLens 2. If there is a problem arising on a specific area of the vessel, we have the remote expert that's on shore, and we can connect them. They don't need to travel. They don't need to make that expensive and timely correction, at least to the problem. It's done remotely. When we first introduced this, we found out that the coverage and Wi-Fi coverage on boats were very lacking in specific area where the work would actually happen the most, therefore where there's the most likelihood of having a breakdown. And so once we discovered that, there was just no way to scale this more than what we had at the beginning. So we had to go back to the infrastructure pillar of such solutions, which is like, we need to redraw and rethink about the connectivity of our vessels. So it's interesting when you start to look at industry that use remote assets, the pillar before even starting to look into XR solutions or metaverse technology for that matters, is like the pillar between structure, IT infrastructure and connectivity is key. Data governance is also another one. But that's our main challenge. And to be fair, we are starting to find some solutions, but we are not to the point that we figured it out. There is some options about maybe some private 5G network on board a vessel, which uses like slower bandwidth. Therefore, you need more relay point, but you have a possibility to have more coverage. And this is what we are trialing at the moment.
So if I understand what you're saying, and it's literally physical limitations that are preventing that. So you're on a boat, right? I mean, it's obviously a steel structure. I mean, people probably encounter that, and trying to get routers and mesh networks in your home.
Yep.
Small degree around refrigerators, and the kitchen's always a bad spot. John, we'd love to hear your perspective on that too. So why don't you share a little bit about UrsaLeo, just to set the stage for folks, what you folks are doing.
Yeah, so basically we're not a standalone product. We're a product that's designed to be integrated with existing IoT platforms, or any software, but IoT platforms. And then we use Unity gaming engine to actually render 3D objects. And we combine those objects with typically sensor data. That can be static sensor data, or it can be RF tags moving around. And then we serve the whole thing up in a nice looking dashboard. We've integrated with 4 or 5 different IoT platforms at this stage. We do some business in oil and gas. Most of our business or new business has been in the smart building space. So we're seeing large buildings with 8 to 10,000 data points coming off them. That's where our platform you can really start to get some value out of rendering that amount of data.
You touched on a couple different things. So it would talk a little bit about the gaming engine piece, because that's a differentiator, right? I mean, or at least a different approach to how typically organizations are pulling in 3D models or even generating them.
Yeah, so gaming engine technology has become very advanced in the last, 10, 15 years. There's 2 huge platforms, Unity and Unreal. We picked Unity. The advantage to using it is that people put a huge amount of energy into rendering 3D objects quickly with nice lighting, nice textures, that they look really good. And Unity is a great way to do that. It's used quite a lot already in construction projects and architectural projects. So it's a logical step to take Unity into the full industrial IoT world. I think is kind of, that's what we decided to do. So,
in integrating with a platform, I mean, can you peel that back a little bit, both of you? I mean, what does it take to do that? I mean, and what types of, not necessarily vendors, but in what type of a product are we integrating with in order to enable this technology to work?
So in our case, it's IoT platforms. There's hundreds, different industries tend to use different vendors, but they all basically work the same way. Sensor data is collected into a gateway. The gateway then encrypts it and sends that data typically up to the cloud. Can be on-premise, can be in the cloud. So for us to integrate with that, we have to get the data through an API typically. And then we build an interface that, security token exchanges and so on. So then we can render up the object. We use a React framework to combine the different web applications on the screen. So we can integrate with an existing IoT dashboard, and we just become another sort of window data source inside that dashboard.
Gotcha. Thank you. JB, how many, when you're doing these type of installations, I mean, do you tend to standardize on one type of product or one type of platform, or is it a mix of different technology that you're trying to integrate with?
It's so the way we do, so we have a digitalization team, so digital transformation team, which looks at different array of technology and solutions, such as, IoTs will be one of them, digital twin will be another one. So it's basically those programs within the company where there is a definite collaboration between those two and overlap. And so it's usually multiple products that are looked after. And then with also an idea and a strategy around how do they combine long-term and how would they interact long-term. But you were talking about integration, Greg, and this is also one of the key when we interact with vendors, is that what experience do they have into integrating some of the system we already have. Just like John mentioned, it's very industry specific. And so ultimately, if you've worked with a couple of customers within the industry, doesn't mean that you know our system either, because everybody do their own stuff in a sense. But the idea of standardizing, like all our projects are they are bespoke. We don't have something off the shelf. It's always something new. So we need to have solutions that are able to be basically modernized and tailor-made very easily, which can be a problem when you try to centralize and standardize things.
Got it. Well, maybe dip our toe into the technology side of it. And I think you'd mentioned HoloLens is one of the technologies. So let's talk about AR and VR a little bit.
Yeah.
Augmented and virtual reality. So there's the true gaming world that's out there, right? Facebook's platforms and some of the other things, and then you have some of these more robust industrials. Where do you guys see that technology right now? What's the current state of the union? Where does it need to go?
It's a great question, Greg. So ultimately, my vision for Subsea 7 basically relies on device agnostic approach, which means that basically we need to rely on web platforms, more on WebXR, on open standards, so I can reduce friction to scale, basically. what we've noticed is that if I want to have if I want to do a design review in 3D in VR or in multi-user setting, I need to have quite a beefy computer at the moment. There are solutions online where you can have like WebXR solution. A lot of companies are starting to have that possibilities to even take a scenario from Unreal or Unity and put it online, remote rendered. There are several benefits to that. You can, by doing this, you obfuscate some of the data. So there's some easier conversation around cybersecurity and that. But this is pretty much where we see it going. And what we want to do, our vision is to basically train some of the individuals that are CAD experts, upskill them to have that possibility to basically start programming in Unreal and develop and basically democratize the 3D approach to the project themselves. So that's pretty much the vision that we want to see, and seeing that transition into web and also integration within team.
How about you, John? What?
Yeah, so we we don't do anything in virtual reality because typically people are using our stuff in kind of industrial settings. So clearly putting on a headset when you're walking, if you're walking in a hazardous environment, it's not a great idea. So we do stuff in augmented reality. There's two types of augmented reality. There's what's called adjacent, where you're creating a 3D image of something that you can look at through an iPad camera or through an iPhone or a headset. And then there's overlaid augmented reality, where you're actually putting information on top of a piece of equipment. So right now we support adjacent augmented reality. I do think the whole conversation about bandwidth is a very valid one. It comes up all the time in industrial settings. I think 5G micro-based cells is a great solution, because you can cover a reasonable sized factory with probably a couple of access points, and that does give you decent bandwidth. And I think what's going to happen is once that bandwidth really is consistently there, then we'll see more and more applications around especially augmented reality. But at the moment, it's spotty. I think the bandwidth is an issue.
How about latency requirements for some of this tech? I mean, I know there's certain environments where delay is not a problem, but if you're driving a car down the freeway, you don't want the information going to the cloud to try and identify whether that's a deer in front of you or a shadow. Mm-hmm. What are you guys seeing from that perspective?
There's a limited number of applications where you want to run edge computing, and you want your server to be kind of on premise, so you don't have the latency of going to the cloud. But there aren't too many applications I've seen where it's that critical. Yeah, you get a 1 second delay from a sensor in a building to seeing the data in the cloud, maybe, or half a second. It's that sort of order. So it's only really if the only times I see it being an issue is if there's a control loop inside the building, and the piece of equipment needs to be, the circuit breaker needs to go, and it needs to go within X number of milliseconds. Or people just prefer having the data in the building. Sometimes there's still that thinking out there. But typically the delay to the cloud isn't really that critical.
Yeah, I echo what John just said. Like maybe the only timing, I mean, especially now in my business, there is no much need for very low latency. Ultimately, maybe if you are an operator like Chevron, BP, or those guys, if you have data that needs to be relayed from the well itself straight into the operation onshore, it's critical for you to stop it. But again, like you're talking about, I don't think it's that value adding to have a very low latency to basically add to the proposition value at the moment.
You brought up the point earlier too, and we're kind of starting to talk about it now from the data itself, right? Whether you got things at the edge, you got things at the cloud. What needs to be considered from a data governance standpoint?
I mean, there's so in our industry, there's a lot of regulatory bodies that still rely on 2D data. Okay, so it's just what it is. Like for permits, for licenses, and so ultimately we are a 2D driven industry, which makes the 3D data usually an afterthought. In my experience, it's very much considered as an output rather than an input. and therefore there was not much attention that was paid to that. Now it's starting to change because we're starting to create more 3D data, just like all the scan that we create of all the vessels. We need to have a centralized data of a centralized way of collecting that data and sharing that data. Not also that, but we need to all be able to add to that data, just like by creating another scenario from that. So being able to have system in place and governance in place and ownership of this data is key, and it's something that's not natural. At least in my company, I've seen it in other companies as well. It was not a natural transition. It was very much something we had to pay close attention to.
Any thoughts, John? Or
I mean, data security is pretty well understood at this stage. You know, we keep data as long as our customers want us to keep the data. It doesn't belong to us, it belongs to them. We're providing, you know, a way of storing that through you know, the AWS-based platform or cloud-based platform. And then there's, you know, standard security measures in place, things like security tokens. So hacking into a cloud system is actually quite difficult. I mean, it's they're physically very secure, and then, you know, the modern security techniques makes the data secure. So the data governance then comes down to, you know, our agreement with the end customer around how much of their information they want us to keep for how long, who's got to log in. Very important, but it's, yeah, I think it's pretty much an understood problem at this stage.
any other facets from a cybersecurity perspective? I know, you know, it's one thing to have things in the cloud, but what about at the sensor level or at the interaction level? And I know you're literally on an island, JB, you know, so to some extent, but you know, there's patch issues, I mean, things like that. Are you, what level of awareness do you guys have around that, or have you seen anything nefarious, you know?
I mean, so the interesting point is that we're starting to, so if I take a step back, we have seen a dramatic increase in phishing attempts, in cybersecurity attempts to get information, right? And once we engage with a solution, with a vendor, with a partner, there is that first step of having the cybersecurity questionnaire, which is a good thing because it at first crossed the T's, but ultimately it doesn't really. I think we need to take a harder look into the life cycle of the solutions or the product, because there are cases that you would not maybe think of. Let's say, for instance, you introduce the HoloLens 2 with an offshore remote assist, or guided instructions vendor. Well, if while you're actually recording the instructions on offshore with a vessel, you may capture some of the data of the customer, and that data should not leave basically the headset. But then if the individual bring that headset home, is now on his home network. So like there's a whole scenario to be played. And it's, I think, at least from my experience, when we introduce this solution, we don't foresee those solutions, and there is need to be some guidance from either IT or the cybersecurity team at the point to basically sit down at the table and say, okay, what would be the worst case scenario, and how do we actually deal with that data that may not be able, or that we may not be able to capture ultimately.
So we've got Renee. I'll just answer these. By the way, please send in your questions. I know that we've got a large group of people attending today, so feel free to drop those in the Q&A window, as I mentioned before. I think we should just give you a reminder too. But let's see, we got a question from Renee. It says, the disadvantages of programming AR experience is you might get disconnected from the original data, CAD, meta information, etc. How important would you rate the availability of a digital thread to more or less automatically connect data with AR experiences?
Well, it's a good question. It's like most answer in that realm, it depends. But like if I was to take a shot at it, like if I'm offshore on board of a vessel, having access to the project data is key. Now the project data doesn't, if we want to be honest as well, like it doesn't change every 5 minutes. Once I have a process to, let's say I'm going to go offshore to install a pipeline, the process to do so is known in advance. That's why we have work instruction, we have things like that. So the connection, the immediacy of the connection is not something that's critical in our operation on a day-to-day basis. I don't know if John has any anecdote on his end, but for us, it's not that critical.
Yeah, so I think you've got kind of two ways of delivering the data today, and typically what we do is when you fire up the application, you're downloading that 3D model and augmented reality functionality, so it's actually on the computer. So if the internet goes down, the model's still going to be there. In the future, I think JB just touched on it earlier, there's the possibility of rendering the 3D object in the cloud and then just streaming the output from the cloud to the end user. That's where I think you're moving from a sort of Netflix the old way we used to use Netflix, where it came in the mail. Where you use Netflix today is you stream, and I think we will get there. But bandwidth does have to then be a concern, because if you don't have the bandwidth, the 3D rendering is not going to be delivered. But today is not an issue because we're downloading the models. We're viewing them through a web browser, or we're viewing them through a iOS app. But the actual 3D data is on the computer. Obviously, the sensor data is coming in real time. So if there was internet connectivity issues, what you're going to lose is the actual sensor value readings, because they won't be able to get to the cloud.
Got it. So if that answered your question, Renee, if not, ping us back here again and we'll add some additional thought to it. Mohammed's asking, are you considering IoT platforms as development platforms for IMV solutions or apps, or only as a data source integration?
So the IoT platforms we work with are typically standalone products that are designed to show information on traditional 2D dashboards. Their limitations, obviously, as a 2D dashboard, you can get 12 data points on it, 10, 12 sensor readings on it. So the reason we add the 3D element is we could render 10,000 data points in a single screen, not 12. But the IoT platforms, as I said, there's different ones in different industries. They all basically do the same thing. They gather data from sensors, they store the data on premise or in the cloud, they display the data on a 2D dashboard. They usually give you some analytical capabilities, so you can sort of slice and dice that data. But that's the fundamental functionality of every IoT platform we work with is pretty much the same. They look different, but the functionality is pretty common.
And an interesting story that I got from the stakeholder that I was pitching to. We have 3D model of our vessel. We have scans of our vessels. It doesn't take much to think about, well, I can actually add all the SCADA system and the PLC data coming straight into the 3D model. The answers I got back from my stakeholders was like, it's a nice to have, not a must have, because if they want to have access to the data itself, just like John very mentioned, if you only have a couple amount of points or data points to be displayed, like, I just need a 2D dashboard. I don't need to know where that data is located on the vessel. I know roughly because it's a little amount of data ultimately. Now, if you have, just like John mentioned, 10,000 points, this is where it would be useful.
Yeah, once you've got that amount of data being combined, with the 3D model, there's all sorts of visualization stuff you can do. So we make a power socket glow more strongly depending on how much power is going through it, and that's really where you start to see, somebody looking at operation of a whole factory, a whole manufacturing facility, a whole building, with both static data and dynamic data, robots or whatever moving around inside the building. That's when it goes from being a nice to have to that's kind of really the only way to do it. The only way you're going to be able to show somebody a real overview of the operation of the whole facility in one screen.
But that's an interesting point, John. I think it kind of parallels Chirag. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. Chirag says, do we need smart glasses to start with industrial metaverse? And I think you just starting to paint that, maybe even paint a larger picture for folks about the type of installation that you're doing. Installation is not the perfect word, but what's an example of one? in the oil patch? How many sensors? What are those sensors sensing? What does that look like to someone? It might help to give them a better visualization of what we're talking about here.
I think there are two sides, two answers to that question. First of all, do you need smart glasses to start in the metaverse? No, because you don't start with the technology, you start with the problem. And that's sometimes people get stuck into that. They see all these hardware announcements like, oh, this is cool, and then trying to find a problem for that. So don't start with the solution, start with the problem. But in terms of so my realm of industry, it's interesting because our assets, the one that we need to have the most data about, is the vessel, right? We have IoT platforms that basically feed the data, whether it is the sea state, whether it is the amount of fuel left, the hydraulic crane level, and so this is very much related to operational processes. This is something that once it's set up, like you don't typically on a welding line, having data connected all the way up to the shore doesn't have much value. It's just being able to centralize on the vessel and to have, just like John mentioned, a one picture or one view with all the data points. This is where it's valuable. Especially if there is something that goes down, and then the whole vessel, which is like a very big asset, very expensive asset, stops for more than 2 hours. But if you want to start within the metaverse, if the industrial metaverse is, as we were mentioning, a digital twin plus a collaboration layer, one of the first pillars you need to look at was connectivity, like we said, and check, first of all, what solution are you trying to integrate together? What kind of problem are you trying to solve?
Anything from your perspective on that, John? I know you got.
Yeah, I think I guess we were probably a little early with some of this technology because we were kind of a problem looking, a solution looking for a problem a little bit. But what we found is, two areas. One is remote maintenance applications where you don't want to send somebody out because it's expensive and you need a way to collaborate, and having a 3D model as a digital twin is a great way to enable that collaboration. And then the other area we see is where there's just a lot of data, and how do you make sense of that? We've got buildings which have got chiller systems, they've got air handling systems, they've got heating systems, they've got water heating systems. All of those things that kind of react with each other as energy is used by the building. And being able to see all of those systems in kind of a single, encapsulated view, that's where we're seeing activity and value. But it's definitely, don't start with the technology. Personally, I think AR technology still has a ways to go. Some of the big hardware players are going to release a product, which traditionally is a leap forward, and I suspect it will be. I think the current hardware is a little short on memory, a little short on processing power.
Yeah, it has made some great advance, but it's just like John says, we're not the form factor as well. Imagine something that 2 out of 3 people right now have glasses, right? So John and Greg, and this is not very much a topic that gets approached often when you're trying to scale. Yes, you can run a pilot that's going to have a HoloLens 2 or a RealWear HMT1. But how do you accommodate for specific, especially in VR? Like VR was a big deal when can I use my glasses or not? Well, no, you can't, or it's going to be squashed. It's something that approach and the form factor, and how do you make it so that truly everybody can use it? We're not there yet.
Yep.
Maybe even taking a step back for a second, what guidance do you have for organizations that are looking to do this? I mean, I know you're both working in robust industries, whether it's a smart city where you get these massive installations. What would you tell somebody that's looking to start an initiative like this? Where do you start? Do you go big or go home, or do you start small? What's your thoughts there?
Yeah. So the first thing I'll start telling is trying to find peers in the same industry that you are, because a lot of industries started already. So the good thing is like you don't have to do like me or a couple of other folks like 5 to 6 years ago trying to do the same, starting and trying to find those people. So find 5 people that are inside your industry, competitor maybe, that are started the same thing to just have an insight. Then next is start to talk to your IT guys. I know if you're in business and you just move into a position that's about transforming digitally something, bring donuts, bring whatever is the local flavor on your country to your IT teams, and start to understand their process, because ultimately they need to be involved in day one of anything that you're going to try to do, which is not a natural way of doing things. At least in my company, it wasn't, because they are seen as a support function, but they are more than that because they need supporters to be a support function. And so that will be the one thing. Then you could definitely go to conferences. There are many around, just like this one, where you basically learn about the subject, and then learn about within your internal processes the budgeting purpose. So if you see a problem that your frontline worker have, or if it's about that there is data that is not being captured, that could be captured by the sensor and centralized somewhere. Start with that problem. Talk to both your frontline worker and the mid management, and understand where's the pain point. And once you have that pain point clearly established, then look at the technology, because it's not what XR can do for me. Is like, well, how do I solve my problem? So either it is capturing reality 3D scanning, because now a lot of people have access to the assets that are on the field, and you want to bring them back to the office. If it is about sensor data, you want to learn about connectivity, figure out what do you have. All these steps, pretty much from knowledge to understanding the process internally, to also start looking outside of your company in the same industry to see what's going on, and see if there are some names of vendors or solutions that are common, and so that you can start building blocks ultimately.
We got, let's see, a question from okay, this one's anonymous. How much does Web3 address the ownership of data question, especially the archiving of the data now that the operational level is achieved? Is there a piece of technology missing, like a data lake?
John, what do you have to say on that?
So ownership of the data, first of all, that is covered by the license agreement between whoever's the software vendor and whoever's is the data. Because assuming that somebody's using a third-party IoT platform or working with us, our position is that the customer owns the data for a number of reasons. One, it's a ownership governance point of view. Two, if there is sensitive data in there, it's not we don't want to be the ones who are responsible for sensitive information. And then in terms of, is technology available to store the data? Absolutely. I mean, short term, you store it on a local drive, using whatever Amazon tool you want to use to just, probably it's stored in a database, going through to glacial storage where you archive the stuff, and it takes 20 minutes to retrieve the data when you want it, but it's extremely inexpensive to put very large quantities of data into glacial cloud storage.
Yeah, and I think so from on the other side of the fence, there is still silos of data, right? In a lot of companies. Now, that Web3 will probably just highlight some of those silos even more. And it's up to the companies to just take, because most of the thing that you see also in digital transformation is like some companies just modernize a process that they already have rather than transform the process that needs to be transformed, and like there's no true evolution rather than update, if that makes sense. And so we had to, so ownership of 3D data is a good example, because we had to look at a PLM system, right? And so while introducing that PLM system, now we have a way to have a centralized point of access to the project data across the world, which then leverage a possible building block for a collaboration piece around this 3D asset. So it's about building blocks. I think it's going to highlight most of the silos. Is there a missing piece? Again, like it depends. Some companies are very much in a leading effort of having centralized data, 3D data. Therefore, I don't think there's a missing piece around that. So it very much depends.
Yeah, scanning is something that we see, especially when we work in the building space. Most buildings more than about 10, 15 years old were probably designed in 2D. But there's companies out there now that will come in, they will scan your building, they will create 3D CAD for you from the scan. It'll be very accurate, and they'll deliver it back to you, as a service, and it's pretty inexpensive. It's a few $1,000s to do a building probably, and we can use that as a great starting point for the 3D world. So that's very often one of the conversations we have is, well, we don't have 3D models of our building. We've only got a 2D floor plan. Well, getting 3D models created is a good idea anyway. And that can easily be used as the basis for a digital twin, and that's something we have several partners we work with that do that to fulfill that role.
So we've got some questions coming in from the web as well. We're going to weave these in. It's an interesting one. In many Gulf countries where voice over IP is banned, how remote assistance or remote support works well. So it kind of opened that up even to the training aspects of this, because we haven't talked about training at all. Opportunities there.
So you can't even use Zoom in that case with voice over IPs. I suppose you could dial into a Zoom call. That's what it sounds like. Yeah.
I mean, we had a story about as we were rolling out Teams, we had Teams the way that we had rolled out Teams, it wouldn't work in China, and so we had to find a third-party solution that would allow us to basically do that remote connection, which there was, but I'm not entirely sure what is the technology workaround that was used there. But it was at the time there was LibreStream that was helping us to actually circumvent that on some of the RealWare HMT1, where we were able to connect to with voice over IP for that.
Yeah, so I think voice would be the only piece that would be a potential issue if voice over IP is banned, because when you're doing a collaboration through our tool, you're opening a WebSocket directly into the server. You've got on-screen annotation drawing, you've got chat. So then you'd have to, I guess, just use a cellular phone to dial into the Zoom or conference or whatever to get voice. So it could be done.
Some kind of a workaround. I mean, Volker's got a similar question, not from a restrictive standpoint, but is how important could voice interfaces and voice AI become for the human users to operate in the metaverse?
So I've talked a lot about AI recently with various people who trying to do certain things, like for example, you're scanning a building, but you want to identify all the individual assets in that building. Applying AI to that problem to actually label and tag the assets somewhat automatically. That's where we see some activity. I think AI, understanding human speech is kind of a customer support tool mostly, from what I've seen of it so far. Yeah. So I think AI has got a huge part to play in all technologies. So it's clearly one of the foundational technologies of the century. It's not the magic wand that people kind of tend to think it is. It does require data normalization and training, and there's a lot to doing AI and doing it right. A lot of companies out there who specialize in it. But yes, AI is going to play definitely in the 3D world. That automated tagging of assets is that's a great AI application. And
yeah, if I can give an advice to any company that's trying to employ either AI vendors or things like that, is to understand how did they train the algorithm and what is the depth of the data that they actually ingested before being able to market something, because that's usually key into the accuracy and what kind of success you're gonna have is from that. If your company, there was a great example, and I can't remember the name of the company, but they've been, it was an Indian company that ingested for more than 10 years data from construction site and was able to have a very refined product. And when you were comparing the results with younger company, like the comparison couldn't hold because that model was so much better because it was trained better. So understanding that when you go into the AI venture is key, I think, as well.
You know, Nicole has a question kind of tangentially on what we just said. You know, how do you upskill your training and consultant staff for these new technologies and find the right solutions for training settings? So maybe even just beyond that, just how do you bring everybody up to speed and leverage that technology? What have you seen in the field?
I mean, in the field particularly, so to give you an idea, an example, we hire skilled labor. So some of most of the welder and the technical welders are skilled from a third party. So the training is not on us on that particular item. When it comes to our own workforce, which is pretty much on all the engineers, this is where we first start on a voluntary basis, offer programs that allows you to be upskilled. And we have this in the Gulf of Mexico in Houston, where we have an Unreal development program where people can pick up Unreal, and we have assets available, and they can basically help the different project teams to do design reviews. But yeah, so for training specifically, I've seen a lot of like good guys to talk to, other guys over at Chevron or BP or the major who have a lot of skilled personnel that is hired and trained to do so.
Yeah, I think probably one way to answer that question is you've got to make the user interface completely simple, intuitive. And if you think about the revolution that happened when we all got smartphones 15 years ago, you know, all of a sudden we had a complex electronic device, but it had a user interface that meant you could actually use it. Didn't require training. You didn't have to read a manual. It's not like a TV remote control where half the buttons are completely obscure. That user interface and making a product that easy to use is actually extremely challenging. And that's kind of where, you know, we spend most of our time is on that user interface. We've got some background from Apple, but that is a key to getting any product, any system, you know, like this out into the field. You'll get enormous resistance from people unless the thing is just intuitive and easy to use. And I've seen many projects where that was an issue, and people found it very, very hard to get maintenance staff to use the products because they just didn't like it. They wanted to use, you know, go back to their clipboards. So user interface is all important. It's one of our big sort of selling points, is that we've spent a huge amount of time on that.
This is an interesting, an anonymous one came in. What kind of a plan do you have to upscale your people's skills, I should say, even if they have a degree in the subject matter? You know, remember, you're extending the level of the art. So kind of to that point, right? I mean, are people coming out of school, what level of competency do they have in this emerging area, if any? What are you guys seeing?
So we've really got two types of technical resource. One pretty much comes from the world of gaming. So game developers. So that's the, you know, one of the skills we hire in is people who had a couple 5 years experience developing games. And then the other type of expertise we have is cloud, IoT, big data. And again, it's hiring senior people who will then, we can bring in more junior people and they'll get trained. But it's, you know, we've got those two disciplines, and both of them are you work with your peer group as they, you know, and as you go along, you'll get more experience. You understand the cloud tools available better. You understand how data security works. So it's the same as any company. You hire senior people and they train the more junior people.
Yeah, and a note about the usability. There is a great book from Steve Krug that's called "Don't Make Me Think," and that's a great example of the stuff that you can apply for user experience. When it comes to, I mean, I talked a little bit about the vision that we have about upskilling our people. It first take a volunteer approach. We have to have some of the individuals that need to be volunteering in order to do so, and then maybe by doing so, other people will notice it, and then they will decide to be upskilled. And you'll find out that a lot of people who actually are the smart individuals in your company will actually see the opportunity, say, hey, I've seen that we can improve this process, and as doing so, maybe some of the time that I'm spending could be used somewhere else, rather than the mindset of, oh, you're going to take my job. So foster those individuals, because they are a beacon of opportunity to develop things within your own company, and also give a good example.
Yeah, I think implementation is it's not just the technology; it's also people's working practices, their skill sets, what they're comfortable with, what they're prepared to use technology for. All of those things we see come into play.
Yeah, this is a question that's a little bit, it's tangential to this, but it's relevant. I mean, so what about intellectual property protection in the industrial metaverse? Is it going to be trust-based, DRM-based? If you get a detailed CAD model, from a collaborative metaverse, what stops somebody from pirating that and running with it to make parts or product?
Well, I mean, I think it's almost a non-existent problem for us, in a sense of if the 3D model that would be given or that will be shared on, it will be already optimized in a sense of polygon-wise. So it's not the full model that's available with all the intricate layers, with all the IP that's close to that. So it's on the company that actually create those assets to have a deeper understanding of what kind of level of details do I need for these solutions. And most of the times, if it is a solution that's just a visual aid, detail is not really required. And you see some of the design reviews being done with just blocks sometimes, where no textures whatsoever, because it's not about the hyper-realism, it's more about the exactitude of one operation with another one.
Yeah, so same for us. When we take CAD and turn it into a gaming asset, one of the things you do is you reduce the number of polygons pretty dramatically. So although it looks pretty, very photorealistic, and it's got nice colors and textures on it, lighting features, there actually isn't enough there for you to be able to recreate the piece of equipment. You'd have to get the original CAD files to be able to do that.
And plus, with I think the trend of remote rendering that's going to grow, that's one way to obfuscate the data. So what you're streaming is it's just being streamed, doesn't reside on the device itself. So
that's good insights. All right, so Miriam is asking, what are the most common security issues that you faced in IoT protocols and frameworks or implementations in industries?
The most common?
We touched on this. I mean, what have you seen, I think, earlier? But
so usually the data is encrypted before it's transmitted from the building or facility to the cloud, or to wherever the server resides. The most common, I think, all of the sort of off-the-shelf IoT cores like AWS IoT, or Azure's got a version, and there's a load of others out there. This thing that's going to run in the building, that includes data encryption. So the data that's transmitted to the cloud is already encrypted. And then when you get to the cloud, you've got all the standard cloud ways of securing connections, encrypting the data when you put it, you can encrypt the data as it's stored. So those are the most common things we've run into is the MQTT connection to the cloud, and then typical security token type stuff to secure the connection, whatever connection you're making to an API.
Yep. Not much to add to that. Yeah.
All right, so let's see here. Pre-Tom is asking us, as with previous paradigm shifts, the metaverse is poised to qualitatively transform every aspect of the human experience. So what new dimensions will the metaverse open for sustainability? So a little crystal ball time. How do we see sustainability? Because that seems to be coming up as a more and more common theme.
Yeah, I think 80% of corporations have a sustainability program going on now. So energy usage is definitely one of the areas that a lot of people are focused on. Being able to visualize large quantities of data is very useful when you're trying to fine tune your energy consumption. As I say, we work with buildings that have 10,000 data points, and probably 80% of those are going to be energy readings, some number. So sustainability, but from the metaverse, is going to be driven by the ability to collaborate, the ability to see large amounts of data and sort of figure out what's going on. Beyond that, reporting sustainability as well is something we see a lot of our customers using our product for. They have to report to the board of directors, they have to report to investors who actually funded whatever the facility when it was built. So it's a great way to show off your sustainability in terms of your energy usage in a way that's easy to present to a room of non-experts.
Yeah, and I think again, if I try to stay away from the M word, but like and try to reel that in more from a practical approach, it's all about the collaboration layer on top of what's already existing. So in a visual way, right? So visual collaboration in an immersive space. That ultimately, I don't know if you have the same experience, John, but I've seen a lot of new companies in this realm being started and being completely remote, that also basically foster collaboration remotely throughout the same room. So it's not a far-fetched idea to think that it's going to be just anchoring even more the remote possibilities of working together. Therefore, maybe less necessarily business trip besides conferences and things like that. We are social animals ultimately, so there is that needs anyway, but maybe some of the standard function that work requires, like an accountant doesn't need to be in specific city to have basically a customer in another city. These kind of things could potentially, it's a very big word, potentially help, that the metaverse might help with that.
Yeah, we definitely have customers where they're trying to do remote maintenance, and you've got an expert and there's a limited number of experts, and then they're collaborating with a plumber who's actually installing the water heater or something.
Yeah.
And that definitely cuts down on travel, cuts down on people's windshield time, saves energy, and I think that's only going to get better. I think the ability to do that will just increase and increase as these tools mature and we get better at showing the data and collaborating.
I've got a question on, it's an interesting spin. Why shouldn't the vendor use it as a service? IBM could be a good source. They have something complex that they make themselves. So that aside, do you see any kind of an opportunity for mass metaverse as a service?
Well, that's kind of what we're doing. I mean, we license software to you, which you combine with your IoT platform, and that becomes, we're providing the metaverse piece of that. So we are selling metaverse as a service.
Yeah, I mean, I think again, depending on what's your definition for your own industry, what a metaverse is, and that's just something that it takes an internal, it takes some time to internally define that for yourself. Just like most company had to take a shot at defining what digital twin means for them, either an operational digital twin, either an engineering digital twin. There's so many layers to that answer that there's as many layers for the metaverse. So.
Yeah, it's a mixture of technologies, and unfortunately, metaverse is just the easiest way to summarize them all.
Pretty much.
In a way that people sort of understand.
Pretty much.
All right. Well, it's been a good discussion, and we're coming close to the top of the hour, but we've got time for a few more questions. Maybe I'm going to ask you the big crystal ball one now. And Samir is kind of threw it in here. He says, any thoughts on what the future for the metaverse looks like? And this could be a loaded one. There's going to be, say 2 to 5 years, 10 years, whatever you think you can extrapolate out to. What capabilities do you see emerging?
I think we've touched on most of them. So, I mean, better connectivity, 5G is going to be a key technology for getting the bandwidth into industrial locations that you need. I think better hardware. I think AR will continue to improve, and the hardware will continue to improve, and that will, once you suddenly have a pair of lightweight glasses that you can wear without noticing them in an industrial setting, and it's bringing up useful information, that's definitely going to come. And then we've touched on the idea of rendering the 3D environment in the cloud and streaming that rendering to end users. That's definitely coming. It is a bandwidth problem, but there's a huge number of advantages in terms of what you can actually deliver. So I think all three of those things are trends that I see.
That I echo exactly what John said. Like, if I was to portray it, it's basically having glasses just like you guys are wearing today, that that could be augmented glasses, and with AI coming the way it is, it's not far-fetched that you'd have like a lens that would automatically correct your eyesight, and therefore eliminating that problem of multiple corrections for different people. And then lightweight, meaning that you have a remote rendered capabilities, and you can probably have a camera on that device that you're wearing to capture and transfer what we call a neuroradiance field, which is a lightweight way of transferring a 3D mesh all together, to based with an augmented connectivity around the different places that you interact. Ultimately, the easiest way that I see that is like, when Google Map came up with a satellite and things like that, probably the easy entry for people to actually see that is once Google Maps will add layers of information, even more than it is right now, you'll see people, oh yeah, this is how you can use it. And then we'll go from there. But ultimately, form factor, connectivity, and platforms.
No, it's going to be interesting to watch it evolve. I mean, how close we get to the avatar scenarios of the world and things of those lines.
Yeah,
great conversation, fantastic dialogue and insights. Thank you, John and JB, for sharing your thought-provoking perspectives, knowledge, and your experience.
Well,
thanks again to our sponsors, Dark Pulse, Hitachi, UrsaLeo, Intel, GE Digital, and Siemens. Your support for these ensures that we can share all of this great content with the world. And thanks to you, all the attendees, for listening and for your great questions. Please make it a point to visit our events page for up-and-coming educational webcasts and webinars and events brought to you by IoT World. We have 2 more before the end of the calendar year. We have Analytics at the Edge taking place on November 16th. And we also have IoT World's Manufacturing and Supply Chain Day. That's December 7th. So come on in and do your Christmas shopping. A great thing to do before the holidays land. It's time to move into our next session. The industrial metaverse is built on a strong data fabric. Have a great day, everyone. Thanks for joining us.